Hi, I'm NASA astronaut Alvin Drew. I've flown 2 space shuttle missions to the International Space Station, and on my second mission, I got a chance to read the story, Max Goes to the Moon, to the children of the planet Earth. When I was growing up, I dreamt of becoming an astronaut while watching the Apollo missions to the moon. How many of you dream of becoming astronauts when you grow up? Maybe someday some of you will live and work on the moon, or even travel out to the planet Mars. Enjoy the story, Max Goes to the Moon.
Look, I can see the moon. I wonder how high it is. Do you think we could touch it? What are those dark patches? They look like big polka dots.
People have always been able to look up at the moon in our sky. And they've always wondered, what would it be like to go there? But until quite recently, such a trip seemed no more than an impossible dream. An impossible dream. An impossible dream. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy laid down a challenge.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
8 years later, we were on our way. People around the world gathered around television to watch the first human steps on another world. And Neil Armstrong's words made it clear that the trip belonged to the entire human race. Over the next 3 years, 5 more Apollo missions successfully landed on the moon, raising the total number of people who have ever walked on another world to 12. But then, the visits suddenly stopped. No one has been to the moon since the astronauts of Apollo 17 returned home in December 1972. Isn't it time we go back? Before we begin, let me tell you just a bit about the story. The story is fiction, of course, but it's all based on real science. Everything that happens in the story could happen the same way for real. And even the artwork shows what things might really look like on the moon. The artist even used real models for the characters. Tori, who you see here, was in middle school at the time. And Max was a real dog, a 120-pound Rottweiler who was as sweet as could be and who had a real sense of adventure. that would have made him love a trip to the moon. He was also the only dog we've ever met who wouldn't eat a steak unless you first cut it into small pieces for him. So with that introduction to our characters, it's time for the story of how Max the dog helped people return to the moon, this time to stay. It all began on the morning of the parade. Max had just returned from his trip to the space station. As Max's car drove along Pearl Street, Max looked to the west, and he began to howl just as the moon set over the mountains. In truth, Max howled because he heard a siren. He always howls at sirens. But the TV reporters didn't know that, so they thought he was howling at the moon. A reporter spotted Max's friend Tori. "Why did Max howl at the moon?" he asked. "I'm not sure," said Tori. "Maybe it's because he wants to go there."
Wait! Don't turn the page yet. I'm curious about that moon. You see how it's not quite a full moon, but definitely more than half? What do we call it when it looks like that?
Good question. You know the moon goes through phases, right?
Yeah, from new to full and back again. How long does that cycle take again?
That's actually easy to remember. The word month comes from the cycle of phases, as you can see by adding an extra O to it. The cycle from new to full and back again takes about 29 and a half days. Very close to a month.
Just think moon.
That's a good way to remember it. Well, we give the phases names based upon the shape that we see for the moon in the sky. I'm sure that you know this one.
That's called a full moon.
You probably know this one too.
That's called a crescent.
Yep. Now, notice that the moon in the painting is actually the opposite of a crescent. Instead of a thin part that's bright, with all of the rest dark, it has a thin part that's dark, with all of the rest bright.
I see. But what's it called?
It's called a gibbous moon, and I want you to remember it.
Why?
Because we see the gibbous moon a lot. Each month we see it in the evening, a few days before full moon, and in the morning, a few days after full moon. But for some strange reason, hardly anyone seems to know its name. So, you can help spread the word.
That's a gibbous moon.
By the way, the word gibbous means hunched back.
I see. Look how the moon kind of looks hunched over.
Right. Now, don't forget, next time you see the moon looking like that in the sky, grab your parents and say, "Mom, Dad, that's called a..."
Gibbous moon.
Okay, let's get back to our story now. They thought that Max had howled at the moon, and Tori said that maybe it's because he wants to go there.
Well, Tori's maybe was good enough for TV. By the next day, Max's dream of going to the moon was all over the news. And because no one had been to the moon in a long time, it seemed like it was about time for someone, or some dog, to go. It's not easy to go to the moon. It takes big rocket engines to get a spaceship off Earth. It takes careful planning to make sure the astronauts reach the moon and come back safely. And it costs a lot of money. But everywhere Max went, crowds chanted, "Send Max to the moon!" People wrote letters to the president. So, a new moonship was built and assembled at the space station.
Is that the moon ship down at the bottom?
Yes, you can see the 4 legs that we'll use to land on the moon.
Why are they building it at the space station?
We don't have to. And NASA is actually considering plans that would take us direct from the Earth to the moon, just like in the Apollo era. But in this story, we assembled the moon ship at a space station. The most expensive part of any space mission is getting from the ground to Earth orbit. And the more stuff you send up, the more it costs. So, by stopping at a space station, we could send the moon ship back and forth to the moon without having to launch it from the ground each time.
Tori gave Max the good news. "You are going to go to the moon," she said. "I sure hope they let me come with you."
How big is the moon?
It's a lot smaller than Earth, as you can see in these pictures that compare the sizes. But it's still pretty big. The moon is almost 3,500 kilometers in diameter, which means its circumference is almost 11,000 kilometers. That's close to 7,000 miles, or more than twice the distance across the United States.
So that means the Apollo astronauts only explored a really tiny bit of the moon.
That's right.
Max went into astronaut training again. The other astronauts were glad to have Max back. Max made the long training session seem fun.
Fetch, Max.
Somehow, he always managed to find a stick.
Good boy, Max.
He loved to play fetch while the astronauts trained in the water tank. He also loved to play tug-of-war. And guess who always won?
I'm guessing it was Max.
Good guess. But can I tell you a secret?
What?
Max really did love to play tug-of-war. And he was so big and strong that he beat every grown-up he ever played against. But when he played tug-of-war with a kid, well, he loved kids so much that he always let the kid win.
Tori thought that Max should know a little history before his trip. So she told Max about the first astronauts who went to the moon. Listen carefully, Max. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were the first people to walk on the moon. Their mission was called Apollo 11. They landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped out first. Do you know what he said when he took his first moon step?
Yes, I remember from the clip we saw at the beginning. He said, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind."
Do you understand, Max? Max barked, and Tori took that as a yes. "Good boy, Max," said Tori.
I recognize the scene. There's Armstrong and Aldrin, and there's the lunar lander.
Yes, but look closely at the flag. Why is the flag staying up?
Oh, I think I know.
That's okay, don't tell me yet, because I want to tell you the wrong answer.
The wrong answer? Why would you want to tell me that?
Well, it's a little embarrassing, but it turns out that it's what a lot of grown-ups say. It's so silly you'll probably burst out laughing, but lots of grown-ups try to say that the flag stays up because there's no gravity on the moon.
No gravity on the moon? That's ridiculous. You can tell there's gravity just by looking at the pictures. I mean, if there were no gravity, then the astronauts and spaceship would all be floating away.
That's right. There's gravity on every world, including the moon. And that means that a flag would flop right down as soon as you let go of it. So, can you think of a way that they might have gotten their flag to stay up?
Did they put some kind of pull through it?
Exactly. You can see Neil Armstrong trying to get the pull to work right here.
NASA chose 6 experienced astronauts to go to the moon with Max. Since Max and Tori made such a good team, Tori got to go along too.
Yay! I was hoping she would go.
So the crew of 7 humans and 1 dog blasted off into space. Within a few hours, they were docked at the space station, where their moonship was waiting. After lunch on the space station, the crew boarded the moonship. The crew fired the moonship's rocket engines to gain speed, leaving Earth orbit. Once on their way, they turned off the engines and coasted toward the moon. The trip took a little more than 2 days.
Does it really take 2 days to get there? I thought the space shuttle can enter orbit in just a few minutes.
It really does take 2 days. But you're right about the space shuttle, too. Most people don't realize it, but the moon is almost 1,000 times farther from the Earth's surface than where the space shuttle and the space station orbit. To scale, the difference between going to the space station and going to the moon is as great as the difference between a walk across Central Park in New York and a walk across the United States.
Soon, the moon loomed large in the window, with the Earth far behind. The crew turned the ship around, so firing the rocket engine slowed it down. As the moonship neared the surface, the blast from its engines kicked up a cloud of moon dust. Then, it settled gently onto the moon. Max was so excited about reaching the moon that the crew had a hard time getting his spacesuit on. It took 3 of them just to hold Max while the others pulled the spacesuit over his legs. Tori made sure that Max's tail went in the right place. Then they closed all the buckles and attached his helmet. Finally, they checked carefully to make sure that the spacesuit was airtight.
I know they need spacesuits to carry oxygen so they can breathe, but why are their spacesuits so thick?
Excellent question. You know, if oxygen were the only reason for spacesuits, then they just need air tanks like scuba divers. But spacesuits do a lot more. On Earth, our atmosphere not only gives us air to breathe, but it also protects us from dangerous radiation from space. It moderates temperatures and provides the pressure that our bodies are adapted to. The lack of air on the moon means that any one of those things could kill you unless you had the protection of a full spacesuit.
I get it, but wait. What about those cartoons I've seen where dogs and people go to the moon with only a helmet?
Oh, it's so tragic. But now you know the truth.
When they opened the airlock, Max jumped out. You should have seen the look on his face. He went much higher and farther than he had expected. It also took him much longer to come down than he was used to on Earth. Tori watched out the window and said, "That's one giant leap for a dog."
Oh, he sure looks surprised.
Well, he is a dog, so he couldn't have known he'd go so far and so high.
Because the gravity on the moon is weaker than on Earth.
You're good. Do you know how much weaker it is?
I think I read that the gravity on Earth is 6 times stronger than on the moon.
Yep. That means you'd only weigh 1/6 as much.
So if I weigh 120 pounds on Earth, I'd only weigh 20 pounds on the moon.
And you could lift 6 times as much as you can lift on Earth.
Hey, I could bench press my dad.
And you could jump 6 times as high and 6 times as far as you can on Earth.
I could dunk a basketball.
Better than that. Let's say you can jump 2 feet off the ground here on the Earth. Then, on the moon,
My feet would be 6 times 2 equals 12 feet off the ground.
and a basketball hoop is only 10 feet off the ground. So you could jump completely over the hoop.
How soon can we go play basketball on the moon?
For posterity, the astronauts fenced off the spot where Max made his first paw prints on the moon. There is no wind or rain on the moon, so those paw prints are still there today. Max thought it would be fun to play with a stick. He didn't see any, so he decided to look behind a big rock. But when he poked his head into the rock's shadow, he couldn't see a thing. It was darker than the darkest night, and cold too. Max leaped backward with a look of surprise and worry. Tori bounded over to calm him down. "It's okay, Max. You're a good dog. Just try to stay out of the shadows. Anyway, you won't find any sticks on the moon. Nothing lives here, so there aren't any trees. Here, I brought a frisbee to play with."
She brought a frisbee to the moon?
Actually, it wouldn't be the first time someone brought toys. Apollo 16 astronaut Alan Shepard brought golf balls to the moon. And with the weak gravity, he hit them really far.
Tori got off a good throw, even though her big spacesuit glove made it a little hard to hold the frisbee. Max bounded after it, but it didn't curve the way Max expected, and he missed it by a lot. Tori quickly realized why Max was confused. He didn't know that objects move differently when there's no air. Tori picked up a rock and pulled a feather from her pack. "Look at this feather," she explained to Max. "On Earth, the air would make it float gently to the ground. But there's no air here on the moon, so it falls just like the rock."
Wasn't it Galileo who first figured out that all objects drop at the same rate without air?
You know a lot. Yes, before that, most people thought that heavier objects would fall faster than lighter ones.
I know some grown-ups who still think that.
You know, it's easy to prove that the weight doesn't matter even here on Earth. Watch what happens when I drop this rock and this piece of paper.
Wait, the rock did fall faster than the piece of paper.
Yeah, but was it because the rock is heavier or for some other reason?
I think it was because of the way air affects the paper.
Can you think of a way to prove it?
Sure, just crumple the paper into a ball. It will still weigh the same, but the air won't affect it so much.
Okay.
I knew it! Once you keep the air from having such a big effect, the rock and the paper fall at exactly the same rate.
Just as Galileo said. And now do you understand what happened with Max and the Frisbee?
Yep, it's air that makes the Frisbee curve. So without air, it went perfectly straight, instead of curving like he expected from Earth.
Tori picked up the Frisbee and threw it again. This time, Max knew what to do. She threw it very high, so Max had time to get under it. He stopped and turned around to see the Frisbee coming down. He was perfectly positioned for the catch. There was only one problem. Max, Tori, and the astronauts had plenty of work to do for the next few days. They collected moon rocks for science, and they set up telescopes to study distant planets and stars. But most of all, they loved gazing upward at Earth, which seemed to hang in one place in the sky.
Look, it's a crescent Earth. But I have another question. What can we learn from moon rocks?
A lot. If you study a rock carefully enough, you'll find it holds all sorts of clues that tell you about its formation. The rocks brought back by the Apollo astronauts helped scientists come up with their best guess about how the moon was formed. 4.5 billion years ago, shortly after Earth formed, we think that an object the size of Mars slammed into our planet, which blasted much of its outer layers into space. By programming the mathematics of collisions into computers, scientists have found that the debris could have collected in Earth's orbit, forming our moon.
Cool.
Soon, the longer shadows told Max and the crew that darkness was coming. It was time to leave. Once everyone was aboard the moon ship, Max and Tori waved goodbye to the moon, and the crew closed the door. They fired the rocket engines and blasted off the moon. Just 12 days after leaving Earth, Max, Tori, and the rest of the astronauts were back on the space station.
Wait, didn't you just say that darkness was finally coming?
Yes?
But you said they've been away for 12 days, which means they have been on the moon for about 10?
Yes.
So are you telling me the daytime lasts more than 10 days on the moon?
Actually, day and night each last about 2 weeks on the moon. And it's because of a special way that the moon rotates. You know how on Earth we always see the same face of the moon?
Yes, that's why we always see the same features of the man in the moon, and we never see the far side.
That's right. Now, watch this animation that shows the moon going around the Earth. Notice that the moon completes one rotation in the same amount of time that it completes one orbit.
And since it takes the moon about a month to complete each orbit, then it also takes a month for each rotation. And a full moon day means 2 weeks of daylight and 2 weeks of night.
You're good. And can you also see why the story said earlier that Earth hangs in one place in the sky?
I do, since we always see the same face of the moon. Wherever you are on the moon, you'll always see Earth staying in the same place in the sky. That means we just see Earth hanging there and going through its own phases.
Back on Earth, billions of people watched Max's trip on the news. Everyone talked about it. Some grown-ups said the trip wasn't worth the money it cost. But children understood the excitement of it all. They asked their parents to help send Max to the moon again. But this time, to build a big colony where many children could go visit him and learn about the universe.
Maybe I'll start my own petition for real.
The children were so convincing that all the nations of the world decided to work together to build a big dome colony on the moon. The domes covered homes, offices, and of course, the University of the Moon. They were filled with air so that no one needed a spacesuit inside. Food grew in greenhouses and water was carefully recycled.
Where would we get all the water?
Great question. You know, even though no one has been back to the moon since Apollo, we've sent robotic spacecraft to study the moon from orbit. And just recently, scientists discovered that there's frozen water in craters near the South Pole. A lot of scientists think that these craters would be the best place to build a moon colony, since we wouldn't have to transport the water very far.
Outside the domes, astronauts built great telescopes to observe the universe. Students and scientists made important new discoveries almost every day. The building of the moon colony also changed a lot of things back on Earth. Children tried to learn more in school in hopes that they might get to attend the University of the Moon. Grown-ups saved their money for tourist trips to the moon.
I want to go to college at the University of the Moon.
And I'll bring the rest of the family up for spring break.
Most importantly, the beautiful views of Earth from the moon made everyone realize that we all share a small and precious planet.
Do you see what I see when I look at our precious planet in this painting?
Do you mean the fact that we're seeing more than half of it, but it's not quite full?
Which means that its face is... everybody?
Of course, none of it would have happened without Max. Max was glad that he had been so helpful, but he was not the type of dog to stop at that. It's a big universe out there. Where would he go next?
Max. He's sniffing out facts. He's making tracks. Way to go, Max. You're a good boy, Max. Max. He's sniffing out facts. He's making tracks. Way to go, Max. You're a good boy, Max.